Good afternoon, everyone. It's Thomas Varela here with New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition. We're here for the start of Civic Learning Week, which is a national campaign talking about the importance of being civically engaged. We at New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition are part of this national coalition. So we are here with organizations across the country that are stressing the importance of being civically engaged, understanding the importance of active democracy. And so today we're here to talk a little bit about misinformation, disinformation. This is something that is really important for Black and Brown communities, particularly. While important for everyone, we saw in 2016 our community was specifically targeted with misinformation. And so we're here to talk a little bit about why that's the case. More importantly, how do we combat that so that ultimately, as Black and Brown voters, we are ensuring that we are voting based off trustful information and that we're not necessarily being persuaded in a way that is counter to the needs of our community. And so we're excited to have Tennyson with Black in New Jersey join us in a bit to talk more about his work as a journalist, the work that they do, and how do they think about this issue. So just give us a few minutes. We'll be having this conversation shortly. We see a few folks in the call. Definitely want to shout you out. Let us know where you're at and let us know where in New Jersey you're checking in from. Shout out to, I think, Nichelle with her work in cannabis. Definitely want to make sure that if you're thinking about cannabis in New Jersey, that you're really plugged in with the work that they're doing there. Let's see if we can get Tennyson on the call. Give me 1 second. Hopefully you all had a good weekend. See folks here from Maplewood. Where else y'all in? Let us know in the chat where y'all checking in from. Once again, Thomas Varela here with the New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition. We're a statewide nonprofit. We do a lot around civic education, democracy, and active participation. Elizabeth was good. Elizabeth in the building. Tennyson, we're glad to see you joined us. Thank you for taking time out your schedule.
What's going on?
Not much, man. Not much. Just chilling. Another start of a good week. This week is Civic Learning Week, so it is actually timely that we're having this conversation. When we talked originally about this idea, I didn't have that week on my radar, but it's actually very timely when we talk about misinformation and its impact on Black communities. So really looking forward to the conversation.
Definitely. It's a very important topic.
Definitely. So we'll right into the convo. Tell us a little bit about who you are and the work that you're doing with Black in New Jersey.
Sure, yeah. So my name's Tennyson Dondea. I have been a journalist for, professionally at least for going on a decade. I graduated from Temple University in 2016 and went right into the field. And so that meant working at TV stations, at radio stations, as well as print outlets as a reporter. I've covered the community, I've covered politics, I've covered sports, I've covered entertainment, race and culture, and the list goes on. I founded Black in Jersey, which is my organization, back in 2021, and we are all about media literacy and Black perspectives, as well as building community through news and storytelling. We are currently in the middle of helping to facilitate a few reporting fellowships in South Jersey in partnership with the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University. So we're actually taking people from the community and training them on how to do good acts of journalism. And that is probably the most rewarding work to me at this point in my career, because it puts the power back into the hands of the community, and it also gives people the tools and the knowledge on how journalism works and just how the media works as well.
Nice. Um, So tell us a little bit about how do you internalize the role of media in the to the public? How should the public think about the role of media in journalism?
Yeah, so I think that journalism has several different roles. And so you have one being to inform the public, right? Like I think when people think of the news or journalism and media, they think about being informed. And that's providing essential information on what's going on in your city, in your state, in your country, and around the world. This helps people to make informed decisions in their personal lives, right? And maybe even in their professional lives. Then we have serving as a watchdog, which is monitoring and reporting on the actions of the government, businesses, and other powerful institutions. This means that, this is good for exposing corruption, holding leaders accountable, and ensuring there's transparency in public life. Then you have the role of educating and engaging. So we cover a lot of complex topics, especially when we look at the politics of how society is run. And sometimes a lot of these topics are not always easy to comprehend. So we educate and engage people by breaking down complicated subjects into, palatable information, as well as holding space for debates over conversations that are going on and fostering a culture of discussion and dialogue. We provide again, like providing a platform for public discourse, as well as shaping public opinion. Now, there's a lot of theories out there about whether the media actually is making people believe things or not. But not to get into media theory, but if we just look at realistically, the media does have some power in shaping public opinion, and we hear that at least anecdotally from folks that they saw a news report or they watched a documentary and it changed their outlook. Um, so we're here for that. We're here to also, in this day and age and in this space, especially as the Black press, ensuring that we are depicting all of the culture and depicting, making sure that representation is strong in the news. Um, you have the role of informing people about emergency during times of emergencies, and you also, what we're talking about today, the role of the media and news programming that has segments and programs where they're debunking or fact checking things that have made the news recently, and that has grown directly from this era of social media and just the rate at which information spreads.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point when we think about swaying the media, swaying the public versus being neutral. I know that's always a touchy subject because one could say that, and I think this is always critical for Black and brown journalists. There's always an argument that others will try to make that Black folks will inherently be biased because of their lived experience. And then it creates this notion that for non-minorities, they just have this inherent ability to just be neutral. And at the end of the day, one could probably make an argument that everyone is bringing their individual bias to to the work that they do, and we do have to kind of push back around this narrative that minority journalists are going to be inherently biased, so thus their writing isn't as quote unquote honest compared to non-minorities that they're viewed as just like neutral. Like I think about this when we think about voters, right? One of
Mm-hmm.
the things they'll say is that they'll say soccer moms or they'll say diner voters, and those are some inherent, like there's already a nod wink wink that those individuals are white, versus when you want to identify working class, you have to name Black working class, versus you don't say typically white working class, you'll just say working class, and everyone will just know that that means white working class. So then it creates this narrative that Black folks are always thinking about identity while others are not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just comes down to who is being censored in mainstream media, and beyond mainstream media. I think it's just a microcosm of who is centered in the American experience. And I think that everyone is biased. So we are bringing our subjective viewpoint, our cultural norms, our cultural viewpoints, that cultural prism that we all have, that bubble that we live in, to our work as well. And so, um, I think that's a conversation that has been that we're having in journalism a lot more now. We've seen in the news places like the New York Times, where some of their staff, there's a schism kind of, there's division, there's debate about objectivity and advocacy, and when are journalists being advocates, and is the old school norm is journalism and advocacy are to be totally separate, and I'm only 29, but I said, I mentioned that I've been working in this space for about 8 to 9 years. So, I still kind of have that traditional education that, where when I started working in the industry, you weren't allowed, you get a handbook and it says, you aren't allowed to really do anything. My first boss said that this is not a career, it's a lifestyle. And you realize you can't go to a community event if it's sponsored by a big group. You technically can't show any political bias, this, that, and the third. And I think that is being challenged in this day and age, because you can offer alternative viewpoints, or you can, as a black reporter, for example, champion black issues in reporting and journalism without, misinforming and misleading people. But I'll save that for a little bit later.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. So with that, I guess there's a lot right now. We know African Americans in this election season are being the focus. There's a lot of energy around, what are the needs of African Americans, how African Americans may think about voting, what party they're going to be aligned with, things like that. But there's also this topic around like misinformation, disinformation. So from a journalism perspective, when you guys hear this word amongst you all, like how do you guys define that term?
Um, so there's misinformation and there's disinformation, and sometimes people use it interchangeably, but they're two different things. So I'm actually going to read the definition, a definition I found online. So misinformation refers to false or inaccurate information, regardless of the intent. So regardless of whether there's an intent to deceive, it becomes disinformation when there is an intentional effort to mislead or deceive. So a good example of that could be the claims that the Russian government was, misleading, voters, and particularly black voters during the 2016 election. That would be disinformation if there's that intentional effort to mislead, deceive, to sway an election. Now, misinformation, I see that a lot, and I don't think, especially on Facebook, anybody that has Facebook, anybody that has social media is bound to run into misinformation at some point. And that could be something as simple as a family member or a friend sharing a source that isn't reputable, or maybe uh, misrepresenting the intention of a study or a research or an article. That could be them, speculating about things in the news, and they may be wrong about it, but they may not be intending to do it with any malicious intent or to deceive. They may actually believe what they're spreading, and I think that's what we're seeing more of, is that kind of um, that kind of issue where the intentions are good, but people don't have the training or the literacy or the skill set to know what a reputable source looks like, or how to even understand the information that they're taking in.
Yeah, so to that point, I guess going a little bit into the weeds, if I share something unintentional, but it was wrong information, but the source is intentional about putting it out there because they want us to share it, is that considered disinformation, or is that still is that still considered misinformation on my behalf because I shared it unintentionally, but it's also disinformation based on the source because they were purposely putting it out there? So is there a little bit of both that sometimes happens?
Yeah, I'm sure this is the first time I've been asked that very specific question. But if I'm just, synthesizing what you said, basing it on, the definitions, I would say that there's a little bit of both in there. So you do have disinformation if the the source, the media source, the article is being intentional. That's disinformation. It could be misinformation when you're just spreading the information, even though your intention isn't to mislead. And again, you could very well believe the things that you're reading in these sources.
Interesting, interesting. And so with that, I know as we talked about 2016, I know the National Urban League, they were one of the first organizations to kind of ring their alarm as it relates to the 2016 election. There was actually a Senate report or Senate research, Senate study or investigation, and they actually found that African Americans were one of the most targeted groups by foreign agents as it relates to disinformation, misinformation. Why do you feel that, or from what you guys are seeing, why is it that African Americans seem to be particularly targeted with misinformation? I have my own theories. I think it's interesting when we think about we may not always have had access to quote unquote mainstream platforms. So we've had to build our own ecosystem of media and resources.
Hmm.
So on the one hand, we have built certain platforms, but then at the same time, it does feel like those platforms are now being hijacked. And I know we'll talk a little bit later about some nuance there, but on the surface, it does feel like these platforms are being hijacked to kind of spread some of this misinformation. So, what do you guys see from a journalistic perspective?
I mean, I think a lot of times it's politically motivated, right? So historically, we have seen disinformation used, especially targeting Black folks or targeting Black readers or viewers or targeting Black folks in general, right? Like if we go back to the founding of the United States, Ben Franklin, who is this revered figure in American, in the American founding pantheon, um, he wrote fake newspapers, and a lot of the reports that I've seen about these newspapers that he would write during that time period, some of them would be deliberately lying on Black communities, or lying to get Black folks to support the revolution or to get folks in the revolution to feel a certain way about Black folks and Native Americans as well. And so we saw that during the Jim Crow era, and I mean, arguably even still today, especially we use Georgia as a touchstone on this. A lot of misinformation around, to reinforce segregation as well as to suppress our vote, right? Through false narratives about the intentions of Black voters. So that was, you know, in the lead up to, fairer voting rights laws in this country. A lot of misinformation around that, and again, we've seen it. We saw it in 2016 in an effort to discourage Black folks from voting and to really just sow political discord.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's the one thing that's pretty interesting when we think about these strategies. I think we do as a community have to think about what is the end game in the message, right? America, the fabric of this country is voting and participating in democracy. And so if the end game in the message is to kind of throw your hands up and kind of just say, forget all this, none of this matters, we then have to ask ourselves, is that actually the right approach? Because ultimately, I think one of the things that we think about in this issue is that we recognize that as African Americans, we've had a reason to be skeptical and frustrated with government, right? And sometimes for a number, centuries. And we always have to be careful that our frustration is not being hijacked in a way to feed us apathy, because at the end of the day, we do recognize in this climate, in this moment, that civic participation is one way of trying to create change. Of course, there's a lot of different ways. That's part of the work that we do at New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition, is to stress holistically, how do we think about creating policy change? Voting is one way to do it. Passing, advocating for advocacy. Advocating for legislation, report cards. There's so many different tools that are available. But I think that's always something to think about, is that sense of like, what is the end game of the message? Is the message to say, fall back? We then have to ask that question, like, is that actually the strategy that we need to consider?
For sure.
And so with that, I think one of the things, and I know this is a little bit of a touchy question, so we know that in our community, we've had to kind of build our own ecosystem. We've had to kind of build our own messengers. And so, we've had to rely on, especially in this climate, we know there's actually, I think, isn't there a documentary on Black Twitter right now that's about to be released, or has been released? I think I saw something about that.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I don't know if
Yeah,
it's released yet, though.
Yeah, so if that's going to be released soon, Twitter was an example of how we were able to kind of tell our story. We've seen what Twitter has looked like when we think about Tamir Rice, when we think about Trayvon Martin, in St. Louis and other places, Michael Brown, when we've had to kind of use social media to tell and own our own story. But we also see that, once again, these platforms are being harnessed in a way that is tricky. But I think one of the things that I want to kind of think about is like, how do I phrase it? Because I know in this climate, in this political climate, there's so much right now around like how does one think about information that may be different than what is typically absorbed versus misinformation, right? So
Yeah,
let's just name it. Let's say someone is saying like, oh, I now want to consider other ways to think about advocacy. I now want to think of other, I'm trying to think about which way I'm going to vote, if it's Democratic versus Republican versus another party. And so I'm now trying to digest all these resources. How does one kind of internalize resources or information in media that may be still rooted in maybe viable resources, trusted resources, maybe rooted in some research that can be viewed as like trusted, versus you're now being targeted by foreign agents with the goal of, building apathy?
sure. I think I understand your question. You're basically asking, like, what's the difference between, I guess, information or things outside of the norm or mainstream norms versus like what's misinformation? Is that kind of what you're
Yeah,
getting
because
at?
so like we said, sometimes we've had to get our sources from other places that some may say
Right.
is not quote unquote mainstream,
Or might be
but
biased
yeah, it
or,
may be biased, things like that.
yeah,
But then there's the difference between like, I don't want to give examples because I don't want to make
speculate.
someone, I don't want to like put a category, but
Hmm.
well, I'll name it. Like you see it now, where you see platforms like the Shade Room and Boss Up and some of these other platforms are being viewed as a source. TikTok is a source. These are platforms that are being viewed as a source for information, but some may say that they don't have the same journalistic heft
Right.
or credibility compared to, you know, um,
A
Black in New
traditional news
Jersey,
source.
or the Philadelphia Tribune, or some of these other, the Front Runner, or some of these
Yeah,
other platforms
of
that
course.
are led that are believed to be conveying like the Black voice, if that makes sense.
And also considered to be more traditional forms of journalism, if
Yeah,
that's what I think you're getting at too. Yeah.
Yeah, because on the one
Um.
hand, we've had to disrupt, right? So once again,
Hmm.
we've had to disrupt media. And so we've created these large platforms, whether it's the Shade Room and, and Boss Up and some, and like I said, I want to try to be fair to
Yeah.
them,
Well.
but they
Sure.
are in this space in a meaningful way, you know what I mean? But they're now being viewed as perpetuating certain misinformation because, you know, platforms are recognizing that. We see on Twitter, there's bots all over the place now, right? So then once again, how do we decipher, that's my
Yeah.
next question, but like how do we kind of wrestle with that where there could be messaging that is non what we're used to versus like, nah, they trying to hustle us right now.
Sure. Yeah. So when I think about the shade room, so actually it's funny. I tell people the shade room actually inspired Black in Jersey because I just I s- you know I'm 29. Like I grew up on the internet, and so the odds that you're gonna catch me or my peers like sitting down and watching the news on TV, or picking up a newspaper, or honestly, the data shows even going to a website for a NJ.com, a New York Times, a Washington Post, those traditional sources. You aren't, we're more likely to get our news from social media, and so I thought the approach to at least being social media first and kind of innovating that space for news, they definitely inspired us in that sense. I've definitely seen a shift recently where they're starting to, I guess, they've built trust through their entertainment coverage, actually. And so now that they're delving into more serious news topics, I've seen them jumping into politics a lot more lately. Um, they have the trust of the community already, and now that I've seen them, they've hired. I believe his name is Justin Carter. He does their investigative series, and he's straight from TV news. I think down in Atlanta. Um, I think what sets them apart, I guess, from a more traditional news site would be that they can be a bit gossipy, right? So posting, and sometimes that, or tabloidy. So that could mean posting a tweet that someone said or a celebrity said, and not doing their, like, not reporting on the issue, and maybe they might blow something out of proportion, or somebody will come back later and say, this isn't even what happened. Um, I think it really comes down to a point that you made earlier when you're looking at the sources of information, is it rooted in factual information, right? And so the shade room could, have 99% gossip, and I'm just making, or gossip, I don't want to single them out, or whoever could, have a niche, you know, but if they're reporting on the news is accurate, and it seems substantiated, corroborated, um, I think that, why not? Why can't we see that as a reliable source of information, at least, in that for that purpose?
So that's interesting with that because once again, like to that point, like if these platforms, so it looks like what you're kind of hinting at is that, on one hand, you may have to leverage entertainment to like grow your brand, or you may have thought one time that your brand was strictly from an entertainment perspective, but you may find yourself saying, hey, I recognize that I've grown in a way that I now need to quote unquote be responsible because my platform is big. And thus, if I am now conveying, news, that I am hopefully doing it in a responsible way. And then versus once again, folks just, because I think it just feels like folks are just like, we recognize now that like content is king. So at the end of the day, whatever gets me clicks without some of the journalistic integrity is valuable. So thus, forget all of that, forget worrying about if it's trusted or not. Let's just get the clicks, let's just get the engagement because we grow the followers and then ultimately we get the money. So I think, I do wrestle with that because once again, maybe I'm still, I'm showing my age a little bit. I'm not, of course, I'm aware of these platforms, but I don't know if I engage with those platforms with my source of information. But we got to be honest, like folks get their news from TikTok. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Folks are getting their news from Facebook. So these platforms, like it or love it or hate it, these are now how people get their information. So I think that's why it's really important. I know the comment here that's in the
Right.
chat. And
Yeah. And I want to respond to
go
that
ahead.
too at some point, but
Yeah, go ahead.
just piggybacking off of what you were saying about some a lot of these platforms that we see that are large enough and sustainable enough to be considered mainstream media. For them, the news alone isn't that profitable, right? I think if we see news as I think most people see the news as a necessary resource and not necessarily a commodity or a luxury, right? And so even the idea of paying for the news is foreign to a lot of people. To that point, um, commercial media or even nonprofit media are beholden to um, their advertisers, or in the sense that they have to be making sure making sure that their views, their clicks, their metrics, their reach is sellable, whether that's in the form of ads, sponsorships, etc. So um, I wouldn't say that necessarily skews the information that you're getting, but it definitely sets forth the types of stories that you're going to see. To your point earlier about the soccer mom analogy, that was actually at a news station that I worked at, a TV news station, years ago. We had a poster up, and I can't remember. It was like a cartoon of a woman, a middle-aged white woman, and I can't remember what they said her name was, but they basically said when you're thinking about your stories and your story pitches, you need to be thinking about her. This is our, this is who paid, this is where our money comes from,
That's
basically. Like,
interesting.
this is who watches. So these are the people that advertisers are looking to, convert, basically. And so this is who we're serving, and again, make the news and your editorial decisions based around this demographic, and even how we would write certain things. If you've ever watched the news when they're discussing a new technology or a new social media platform, right? They always, at least, I remember being a kid when Twitter came out, and we would actually me and my cousin would make fun of the news because every time there was a story about Twitter, even if the story wasn't about Twitter, it was about something that someone said on Twitter. They had to like explain what Twitter was, like, to someone at the time who probably wasn't a user or a common user. You know what I mean? And so, again, while I don't think that the advertising per se the advertising component of news skews the truth of the information in a lot of newsrooms, for a lot of journalists, it does at least impact what types of stories are told, and the voice and tone that these stories are told as well.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. I know that that's one of the reasons why when you watch like regular 6 o'clock news, you can see certain stories constantly get mentioned and certain themes constantly get mentioned because there is, I didn't know about that aspect, but definitely not surprising in terms of making sure that you always keep in mind who is quote unquote the prototypical watcher of your news, so that everything is slanted from that viewpoint. So that is pretty fascinating that that is done. And I guess to that point, like it's always about knowing your advertisers or knowing who your clients are. But I think that is something that we have to think about. So, so to that point, I think this actually goes into one of our final questions. Like, what do we do as Black folks? Like, how do we think about? Mickey D kind of mentions it. Like, how do we wrestle with all of this? Like, how do we kind of think about determining trustworthy media sources as African Americans? How do we kind of think about which resources are more relevant for us and how we think about how we want to be engaged when we think about voting, when we think about democracy? I know we have to show love to Joe Madison, who recently passed away. I know a lot of folks relied on him the Black Eagle in terms of media. A lot of older folks, I should say, just to kind of name that, maybe a lot of older folks or folks that have Sirius radio relied on someone like him as a trusted media source. There are now a lot of other platforms that exist, both on conservative and progressive or liberal side. So I guess how should we kind of think about all of that in terms of like what are ways that you all communicate to citizens to know what information to trust?
Yeah, I think it's reading up on media literacy as well as promoting media literacy. Um, and there are a lot of resources online for that. A quick Google search for media literacy, and you'll find a lot of resources. There have been courses, um, online courses that have been created on this topic, especially after the 2020 election and the claims that the election were stolen and all of that. And so, in terms of you know who do you go to, I think it comes down to just knowing the source, right? Their history, their reputation, their background, who's the owner, what's their mission. You should be able to find a lot of these things on their website. Um, do they have a long-standing reputation that's trustworthy? Have they? I would also say too, and this can be tricky because again, this term can be loaded or weaponized, but usually news sources that avoid sensationalism, or at least sensational headlines, clickbait, um, research, data, like data reporting is very important today. Um, and even outside of, news reports, daily news reports that I think about, I think of places like Pew Research Center, which they're not technically a news source. They do research, but they tend to have information around on a lot of the topics that we're talking about, as well as looking. When you're reading these sources, and they're going to be quoting other people, whether that's other stories. So are they aggregating, right? Are they just taking everything they've written based on another news report? So this could look like the Shade Room or what will be considered blogs where news blogs where they're just basically linking to another story. They didn't do any original reporting themselves. You can always tell original reporting by again how much attribution there is and who's being attributed and if everything is being attributed to another news source. I would look for, especially to the conversation about, intellectual, reliable information, is number one, looking for data-rich sources, whether that's surveys or whether that's actual, data that is stored in databases about certain topics, and that could be anything from going to the original news sources that go to the original crime data or original health data, that being the government sources where those are housed, as well as being cautious, but also critically assessing when you do see surveys or you do see data. What's the methodology? Is it scientific? And I don't think any news source is going to be perfect. I mean, that's like asking a person to be perfect. It's just really about doing the due diligence and how do they respond to when they do misinform. Do they go back and put up an editor's note? Do they go back and issue an apology? Are they covering the issues from a solution standpoint, even, right? Or is this just um, you know eyewitness just going up to people who may not have any knowledge or expertise on the subject and getting their opinions, right? So we think about all of those things as journalists.
Yeah, so I do think that hearing you talk, saying that original reporting, that seems to be pretty important. Making sure that the because we do see that that happens a lot, where a lot of these platforms that target our community, they are just a collection of other resources. And so once again, that may be a platform that's just, clicks. Um, I guess, I think one of the other things, like how should one, just an add on, how does one think about this as it relates to like which individuals to follow, right? Like how does one make sure that they're not following a bot or they're not following someone that is trying to purposely mislead or purposely share disinformation versus, once again, someone who is trying their best to share reputable information, but it may just be information that we're not accustomed to or information that we're not typically digesting, right? Because once again, we know that there are some voices that are emerging that are trying to do the work. So I guess are there similar strategies to kind of decipher from like different individuals, like the bots versus actual people?
Yeah, I think the bots or, folks who are not necessarily moving with good intentions tend to be sensational and divisive, um, especially in their language, and can be very clickbaity even. Um, I think when you're talking about folks who may not be traditional journalists, but are, trying to build community around the news and get information out there to people that they feel is important. I think that comes down to establishing ethos and building trust. So, um, do they have a history again of covering what's going on in the community or being that community resource? If you go to someone's page and you see that every day or every few days or once a week or a few times a month or whatever it is, like they consistently are, um, you know, trying to be a trusted source of information, and it's they're attributing things, they're referring to research, um, you know, I, it comes down to that. I think you at any point you should be, no matter whether you're listening to a traditional journalist or someone who's kind of outside of that realm. You should be, as the viewer, as the listener, as the reader, doing your due diligence anyways. Like you should be checking multiple sources. You should be um, you know, Googling to corroborate whether anybody else is reporting on the same issue, and what, does the information that you saw in the source, the original source, line up with what you're seeing around the internet. And that's, again, just I think that's everybody's due diligence is, um, you know, news should not be as passive as it has become. Whether that's, people will say TV or radio reporting or broadcast journalism, and even I guess social media, how we're seeing it now, can be a very passive form of news consumption. I think we should definitely be, again, just like always in an active space when we're listening to the news, watching the news. We should be thinking critically about what we're hearing. How do they know that? Again, who are they quoting? A lot of times the news is just quoting somebody else, whether that's another article or the police chief or a judge or a politician or someone in the community. Generally, the news is repeating someone else. And so sometimes it's not even is the news reputable. It's are the sources that they're covering reputable. And so that's again why as journalists we should be really considering our sources depending on the story that we're covering. But as a consumer, um, you know, also considering the sources. Like, is this person an expert on what they're talking about? Do they have anything to gain from this politically, monetarily, right? In politics, you're never going to get a politician who's going to talk bad about themselves. Why would they do that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I personally don't see any controversy in, and I think would also build trust and ethos if more politicians told the truth about their miscomings or their mishaps, and what they learned from it. But um, you really have to consider the source. Again, so even going back to your original question, looking at a traditional person in the space versus someone who's non-traditional, who are they quoting? Are they quoting reputable sources?
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. I think, like we said, I think the source piece is key. Making sure that the information being shared is rooted in some information. I think also too, rooted in solid information, rooted in best practices, things like that. But I think also too, we just have to ask ourselves, like, what is I know something that I tend to think about. I don't want to say for everyone, but I know what I tend to think about is, at the end of the day, what is the goal that this source is trying to convey to me? Like, as I mentioned, as an organization that is focused aggressively on increasing voter turnout, um, if this source or this information is basically trying to tell me to not participate in American democracy, you have to question it, right? Because it's one thing to be you're voting based on, if you're a Republican or Democrat or whatever your political leanings are. It's another thing if you're apathetic and you're not participating, right? Because I know one of the things that we think about in this work is that, one of our sayings that we always say is that politicians or elected officials, they don't listen to black people, they listen to black voters, because it's a voter that determines if a person wins or loses an election. And that applies to any race, right? At the end of the day, it is a voter who determines if someone wins or loses a race. So if someone is trying to encourage you to not participate, then you have to ask yourself, that's the fundamental bedrock of America, is participating in democracy. If someone is telling me to disengage from this fundamental experience, regardless of how frustrated we are with this experience, we then have to ask ourselves, like, why are you telling me to not participate? Right? At the end of the day,
Yeah,
one can make an argument that we need more of our people to participate, because that is how you force your government to listen to you, because you are using the tools that are already in place to speak to your government. So I know that is always something that I think about in this work.
yeah. I mean, I don't think it's super black and white. I think that, in different circumstances, again, it just comes down to, like you said, the source. And what I've been saying is the source, right? If you have a group outside of your community, trying to get you to disengage, is writing about why you should be disengaging. Maybe there could be, I mean, there could be, some different disinformation there. If you have folks within the group or your community who are reporting on, apathy, I think I think that's a different. I think that might be different motives, because it could be, a way to get politicians to who may not be getting the votes from your community to understand why people are not, supporting. I think about, some of the conversation around, folks like Angela Rye and Charlemagne the God, who, have been talking a lot about this upcoming presidential election, and talking about how, a lot of people do want to sit out because they just really are not enamored with these choices that seem to be forced upon us. So it's not necessarily saying that engaging is wrong. It's just that this kind of feels like, for a lot of people, specifically this year, an inflection point of, like, this is really, like, how many times do we keep going in the same circle? I think if you look at also, just what's going on in the Middle East, and, there have been folks who are Palestinian American who have said, we're not voting for Joe Biden, because he's not, we're not voting for the other side, but we're not voting for Biden because, they just don't like what they're seeing, the response, right? And so, again, I think the source of that information plays a role in determining whether it's a bot, whether it's disinformation, whether it's someone who's trying to mislead you, or to sow apathy.
Yeah.
Um, and
No,
I
but even
think
in that point, like, yeah, even in that point, like, one could make an argument that the fact that those individuals in Michigan, for instance, voted uncommitted is still exercising their right to vote, right? Like
right,
we could definitely have,
right,
we can
right.
definitely have a deeper conversation around like this moment, who do you vote
Hmm.
for, and is this the moment that we need to think about other parties? But in that example, they still exercise their right.
Hmm.
So I think that is something that we ultimately have to think about. Like, they're like, is this the moment to display to demonstrate your displeasure? Like, there's a lot of people that will kind of argue about that. This, we won't delve into that, especially as
Yeah,
nonpartisan.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
but at the same time, I think there's still that recognition that using uncommitted in that moment mattered to them because they're still speaking to their government through their vote. And because at the end of the day, if they were frustrated but chose not to vote, then yes, you maybe are saying that you've already told your community, your politician, that you're frustrated, but when you are able to record it through that uncommitted, that speaks to something different in how you're communicating. So I think that's actually a perfect example of like why you still have to participate in your democracy despite whatever frustrations you may have. Now, you may reflect your displeasure in a lot of different ways, but they still participated.
yeah, yeah. And I think me and you say all the time that voting is just one way to participate, right? And so, um, it would also when you're determining, I guess, again, like whether this is to misinformation that's out there to mislead you, it really comes down to as well just seeing how the other ways that these folks are talking about political participation, and again the context around what they're sharing as well.
Definitely, definitely. So, what would be the best way for folks to kind of stay in touch with you all? Obviously, I know folks can follow you on Black in New Jersey. Are there other ways that you would encourage folks to kind of stay in touch with the work that you're doing? I know that you guys share a lot of this good information.
Sure, yeah, we have a website, blackandjersey.com. We primarily post on Instagram, and we also have an email that we can be reached at info@blackandjersey.com. And yeah, and we're working on other platforms and other ways. We're actually looking into launching a newsletter very soon, and that will be keeping people up to date with some of the headlines around the state as well as events that are going on.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. Like we said, for our community, it's really important that in this upcoming election, but just moving forward, that once again, we know that there's emerging news sources. We have to recognize that our voices haven't historically been in traditional news spaces, but we also have to be careful that as we are growing our own platforms, that our voices are not being weaponized for bad, right? Once again, there's 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 having a healthy skepticism of information, but there's also not getting hustled. And I think it's always going to be important for our community to be careful of that fine line that at the end of the day, that whatever, that what we're doing, that we making sure that we're not being hustled to convey, that we're not conveying information that is actually, disinformation in our community. So it's really important. We know there's a lot out there. We know it's difficult sometimes. You're seeing all this energy on TikTok. You're seeing all this energy on Instagram. It's really important that you kind of find organizations like NJBEC, Black in New Jersey, but then also, too, think about some of the advocacy organizations that exist, both long-standing, like your urban leagues, like your NAACP, but then also others that are doing the work, right? Like I know Salvation and Social Justice in Trenton is doing a lot of good work. New Jersey Institute of Social Justice is doing a lot of good work. So many times anchoring yourself in some of the organizations that are doing the work, then you can hopefully rely on some of the messaging and the information that they're conveying as a trusted resource so that at the end of the day, you don't have to kind of try to find some random source. Like there are organizations that are hopefully doing good work. And so if you're supporting them, then you're giving them additional opportunities to do work because they're being supported the right way. So with that, encourage you, follow the hashtag Civic Learning Week to identify additional events that are happening under the Civic Learning Week platform. We'll be back here on IG on Thursday at 8 p.m. where we're going to be talking about this upcoming, this lawsuit commonly referred to as Abolish the Line, and what does that mean in terms of ballot access and ballot design and this upcoming election. So we look forward to continuing the conversation, making sure that we're bringing our civics, our culture, and our empowerment to the community. So with that, Tennyson, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And everyone else, thank you for joining us. Continue to plug in with NJBEC. Make sure to stay in tune with the work that we're doing. And with that, we're out. Peace.